Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I am back with another fire and maneuver video. For today, I'm going to be creating a buying guide that is going to simply go over all of the nations, listing strengths and weaknesses in order to give people an idea of which nation sounds interesting to them. With a total of 7 nations plus the 2 American DLC, there's 9 nations that you have to consider buying, and they all can play quite differently. So hopefully this video is useful to you guys. If it is, make sure to like and subscribe, as there will be more fire and maneuver content in the future. But otherwise, let's jump right into it. Actually, before we jump into it, I need to add this. When I originally recorded this video, I believed that the upcoming patch 1.3 would be out. However, that patch got delayed by at least another week, so it's important to note that when I'm describing these nations, I'm looking at the 1.3 version of the game, and that's most notably going to buff cavalry and buff mobility-based factions by reducing the damage of range vulnerability alongside some other changes here and there. We know most of the patch notes, so this video, if you're watching it in about the first week or so when it comes out, it might not be entirely accurate, but any point after that, this should be pretty close to what the nations and pretty much show off how the nations perform in patch 1.3 and hopefully later. The first nation we're going to take a look at is the Second French Empire. France is described as a beginner-friendly, versatile, infantry-focused faction, and that mostly holds true. France is a nation that builds itself around a strong infantry corps that is both adaptable and just in general good. It has access to standard line infantry, lots of range drill, and a decent amount of heavy infantry, with a standout unit being the Grenadier of the Guard, who has both range drill and efficiency, alongside a 5 cohesion 6 health stat line, making him among one of the best infantry units in the game. In terms of cavalry, France has a acceptable but not outstanding cavalry corps. It is able to get the job done thanks to things like Lancers and Hussars acting as relatively cheaper cavalry units. However, its artillery tab is where it's the most let down. Having one of the most vanilla artillery tabs, none of this really stands out, and outside of breaking fire at will, these units generally do not get to do a whole lot. But regardless, the simple fact that their infantry force is so well-rounded and potent alongside a strong enough cavalry unit means that France is pretty much able to fight into anybody comfortably. It can adapt to whatever map there is, with access to things like rugged, a lot of melee drill if melee's an issue, alongside a lot of range drill if you need that. France pretty much is able to tackle any situation, and because of its focus on just good infantry, it is also among one of the easier nations to just pick up and play with, because it's going to teach you good fundamentals. In Age of Rifles, France receives a good amount of units, which do vary a bit in their quality. However, the biggest thing that France actually receives is the Fusil M1866, which is a rifled breechloader, or RBL in future reference of this video, which is essentially allowing you to have the superior range alongside the breechloading for double shooting. Combined with their heavy and powerful line infantry, most notably the Grenadier of the Guards, it is an incredibly lethal combination and definitely makes France very terrifying in the late period. On top of that, France also gets access to this early machine gun, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, But with range drill and the fact that it is also anti-personnel, it can deal a lot of damage, giving them a bit more of ranged capability compared to their early period. Cavalry remains roughly the same again. They do get a potential heavy shock cavalry, which can be quite strong, but heavy cavalry does sometimes struggle to see play compared to light cavalry. But regardless, the biggest thing is essentially just the RBL on your heavy infantry being an incredibly potent combination for France. Overall, France is very easy to pick up, and if you're looking to learn the fundamentals of the game, then you pretty much can't go wrong with France. Next up, we have the nation of Prussia. Prussia is a very interesting faction. One of its biggest things is that all of its infantry has the efficiency perk, allowing them to perform 2 maneuver orders in the same turn, essentially allowing them to move and change formation. This makes them potentially very difficult to predict, and if played well, can be a very powerful tool. However, that is not the only aspect of this infantry force, because in the early period, Prussia is the only faction pretty much to get widespread breech loaders on their units. However, this is also countered by the fact that they do not have any basic rifled guns. So what Prussia does is that it has to rely on using efficiency to close in next to the enemy in order to make use of its breech loaders. This is a very unique play style, and especially because of this, their units are quite expensive, meaning that if they get up close, they might suffer from being outnumbered. So there is a delicate balance when it comes to working with this nation's infantry roster, but it is quite powerful if you can use it well. Its cavalry force is acceptable. One of the best things is its uhlans, which are very solid shock cavalry, but it does also have hussars and then a handful of cavalry. Notably, it also gets access to breech loading carbines for one of its dragoons, which is something that not every nation gets access to. And then we get to probably the biggest thing about Prussia, and the thing that everybody always is building around, its artillery. The artillery of Prussia is among the best in the game. Most notably, the Krupp guns are incredibly powerful. Making use of breech loading and also range drill, they deal the most damage of any artillery within the game. They are able to essentially melt any unit that gets close to them, especially if they can double shot. The artillery also makes up for the fact that most of their infantry is only limited to close range breech loaders, meaning that their artillery, if used well, can offset this range disadvantage. In the late period, Prussia also sees a dramatic shift. Most notably, it gets access to the 6-pound Krupp gun and the 21-centimeter Krupp mortar, which are just pretty much the best artillery in the game. The Krupp mortar is ridiculously expensive. However, with indirect fire, breech loading, and range drill, it can pretty much sit behind the enemy, far behind the front line, and completely annihilate units. It's a very powerful combination. On top of that, they also get a handful of additional cavalry units, most notably a few different German nations that add in their own cavalry, and you also get some German line infantry that are different. The Württemberg infantry is interesting due to the fact that it is the only rugged troop, and then it also gets access to the Bavarians, which has shock, something that previously that is lacking within Prussia. On top of that, the Bavarians are also interesting because they are the only infantry unit that can equip the RBL that is available in the late period. This potentially makes the Bavarians your only good ranged infantry within Prussia. Prussia is overall a very interestingly balanced faction that relies on strong use of efficiency in order to maximize the potential of its units. Its artillery is very strong, but also very expensive, and an over-reliance is a very common new player trap. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a new player take 2 Krupp mortars and then some cheap militia, and then as soon as one of their artillery gets charged by a cavalry or something, they quit. So it is just important to note that you'll have to be making strong use of efficiency to make up for oftentimes your smaller army force as you try to include powerful artillery options. The third nation we're going to take a look at is the United Kingdom, or Britain. Britain is a faction that is unique in that pretty much it spams the ever-loving hell out of range drill. Every single one of its infantry unit has range drill. Most of its cavalry has range drill. Yet, surprisingly, not much of its artillery has range drill. However, the simple fact is that range drill is among one of the best perks within Fire and Maneuver. Increasing your damage output by shooting is very, very strong, and the fact that Britain has it on everything potentially makes them incredibly powerful. Yet there is the offset in that it is also very expensive, and in general, Britain is going to have some of the smallest armies among the different nations. Their infantry force is actually pretty well rounded, from a mixture of lighter infantry, line infantry, and strong heavy infantry. The foot guards in particular being the single most powerful infantry unit in the game. Like France, it has the range drill efficiency combo, which is very strong. But these guys also have shock, making them potentially scary if you get next to them, as they could charge in for a ton of damage. It is a very interesting unit and is generally probably the most powerful unit. You also have the Highlanders, which has melee drill and range drill, which is another powerful combination. Their cavalry is well enough rounded, with hussars and lancers that most nations have, but it also has a lot of range drill on its heavy cavalry and on these light dragoons. This means that if these cavalry can be utilized to run around and shoot the enemy, there's potentially a lot of damage coming from them, especially on rear and back shots. Their artillery is overall pretty vanilla and as such not that impressive. The only maybe notable unit is this 9-pound horse artillery, which is a 4-range, 2-movement artillery piece. It's not the best, but it's not the worst thing either. In Age of Rifles, the faction gets a variety of new things. It gets some new infantry, a handful of unique cavalry units, and even some interesting artillery pieces, notably a Gatling gun, and then also a modern 5-range breech-loading artillery. However, easily the most important thing that is available to Britain is access to not only breech loaders, but also to this Martini Henry Mark I, which is an RBL. If you have played France at all, or if you can understand how powerful the rifled breech loaders are on efficiency range-drilled units, then foot guards just become insanely powerful. In a very similar manner to France, these often become like foundational to your faction and can almost kind of solo armies on their own. They are that powerful. You still have access to your strong infantry, but the biggest strength is definitely the RBLs that can go on any of your units, alongside potentially Gatling guns or even a modern artillery piece if those interest you. However, no matter how you build this nation, you're going to quickly find out that you're going to easily be outnumbered almost no matter what you do. There's very little one can do to even offset the extremely expensive costs that these various units have in Britain. And as such, you're going to really have to make use of range drill in order to make Britain work, as otherwise you're just going to get swarmed and overwhelmed. Britain is one of the harder nations to pick up and play with because generally you're going to make mistakes as a new player, and Britain is very punishing to mistakes, as losing even one unit might cost you the match. Moving on, we reach the Russian Empire, which is a faction built around quantity. The biggest thing that will be noticed right away is that every single one of the Russian units has the negative disorganized perk, meaning that these units only regain half of their cohesion at the start of each turn. However, this does also mean that Russia gets cheaper units than almost any other faction within the game. All of their stuff is about $20 cheaper than it normally would be. This means that Russia is able to amass an army that is significantly larger than most other factions without even really breaking a sweat. However, that is not the only thing that makes Russia interesting. One of the more interesting things about Russia is that its units outside of disorganized are essentially standard units. The line infantry have 6 health and 4 cohesion, and as long as you're potentially next to the enemy where neither side is regaining cohesion, you can almost just ignore this downside but still benefit from the cheaper costs. This means that Russia is potentially able to bring a larger army that is capable of negating its downside and acting like any other army. It's a very interesting way that you play, being up close and personal with the enemy, especially due to the fact that you can have overwhelming numbers in order to flank and surround the enemy. In terms of infantry, you have a pretty basic roster at first. You have line infantry, militia, light infantry. You also have 2 forms of heavy infantry, grenadiers and grenadier guards. Now, one of the unique things is that because of the low cost of these units, it is very possible to bring a lot of heavy infantry. And in fact, one of the most basic Russia builds is essentially just spamming the hell out of your light or your heavy infantry, bringing maybe an artillery or cavalry unit and calling it a day. It's potentially a very powerful strategy that gives you a lot of durability and good traits without having to spend a lot of money. Not a lot of nations are able to spam heavy infantry in the way Russia can, and this is a notable aspect of their infantry tab. Their cavalry is also, I would say, a bit above average. The lower cost due to disorganized means that it's easier to fit these units into your builds. But of note, the Cossacks are actually a really strong light cavalry. Shock and skirmishing means that these guys are able to wrap around the enemy and threaten flanks and charge in for tons of damage if they get ignored. For their lower cost, they are potentially very powerful. And this actually goes for most of their units, who are generally cheaper than their contemporaries. Their artillery is also a bit cheaper, however, it is pretty standard artillery and doesn't exactly stand out in any particular way. Maybe the only interesting aspect is that its indirect fire artillery is having anti-personnel if you wanted to try to mess around with that, but otherwise, this is mostly a pretty standard artillery tab. In the late period, Russia receives a variety of different units. Not only does it get access to breech loaders and also access to 2 RBLs, which is always a great thing to have with your range drill heavy infantry, especially when they're a bit on the cheaper side, but you also get access to this unique Finnish Guards rifle, which are in fact the only unit within Russia that does not have disorganized. They also have range drill and rugged, making them quite unique. They also get some interesting artillery options. In fact, they're very similar to Britain, getting access to a Gatling gun variant and also to a 5-range breech loader artillery. This means that Russia can actually bring some pretty potent artillery in the late period to back up their potential large amounts of heavier infantry. Their cavalry remains mostly the same, adding a unique Chevalier Guard, which has some very powerful traits for melee, but is also kind of expensive in the late period. It's overall an interesting addition and does make Russia play quite differently than it maybe does in the early period. But overall, Russia is a faction, if you're looking for sort of a quality-based numbers game, no other faction is really able to match Russia in terms of bringing a bunch of powerful heavy infantry. And if that sounds interesting to you, then Russia is going to be the only real way to try that. The Ottoman Empire is the next nation, and is definitely an interesting one. In a manner similar to Russia, it is a quantity-based faction. However, as we get out of Europe, the Ottomans have a very different approach, and we're starting to get to the point where factions are starting to vary quite a bit from what I would call sort of the more basic and foundational building that we've seen so far among the factions. Most notably, the Ottoman Empire is able to spam large amounts of units, as they all have a large amount of negative traits. Not only is disorganized common, but many units also sport the breakable trait. This is making their units extremely cheap, among the cheapest in the game, but they're also generally the most fragile, and can very easily be broken in one-on-one fights, having to rely on their numbers. Their infantry is relatively basic outside of being cheap, with the most standout unit probably being this Bashi militia unit, which has shock on it, making them very scary melee units. Their cavalry is actually very diverse and has a lot of shock in it, making it a very strong cavalry tab. Then they also have relatively basic artillery, very similar to Russia in having essentially just cheaper units, thanks to disorganized. The Ottomans definitely have to build themselves in a very unique way, as they lack any heavy infantry in the early period, and in general they will have to rely on just mass numbers in order to carry the day. They are notable in being one of the factions that is most likely to bring significant amounts of cavalry due to the fact that they have so many cheap shock units alongside their otherwise cheap infantry. They're able to bring in often more cavalry and artillery than maybe other factions would normally, while still having a respectable amount of infantry to win with. In the late period, the Ottomans still are retaining their cheap units, but they do add some more respectable and heavier units into their roster. Notably, in the infantry tab, they get access to Zouaves, which still have disorganized but are melee drill and decent cohesion, and they also get access to Imperial Guard, being the only heavy infantry available to the faction. On top of that, their cavalry remains mostly the same, just having some slightly stronger weaponry. And then they also get some additions to their artillery tab, getting a Gatling gun. However, they also get uniquely 4-pound Krupp artillery. With range drill and breech loading, these can deal tons of damage, and they also have disorganized, making them cheaper, while only being 3 range. This gives the Ottomans potentially a very powerful artillery piece that comes in very cheaply if they are able to get them in range. The ways the Ottoman plays still relies largely on numbers, using various infantry units to win and sort of being melee focused. They still are able to often bring in a mix of cavalry and artillery pieces alongside their infantry roster. They also have access to a few RBLs, which are commonly going to be seen on the Imperial Guard. But overall, the Ottomans remain true to their core of relying on very cheap units. And a good example of this is that they're one of the few factions that retains the musket, the free musket, to equip their units with, meaning that they can often retain very cheap units, whereas most factions generally have to bring in at least the basic rifled gun on even their cheapest units, meaning the Ottomans definitely retain their numbers faction. If you're looking for a faction that is overall capable of fighting through sheer weight of numbers, essentially a human wave, the Ottoman Empire is the nation that does that the best. There's no competition, as they just simply can drown people in having, twice the amount of units in some cases, making them potentially very powerful if you're able to get into melee and use those numbers to good effect. The sixth faction we're going to talk about is the Austrian Empire. I think the best way to describe the Austrian Empire is sort of a remixed version of France that also is able to be tinkered with in a lot of minor ways. If you're looking to tinker with builds and try out ever so slightly different builds but having a lot of options, Austria might be really appealing to you. Austria is loaded with a large amount of different infantry units, having access to a lot of units that can pass as line infantry, being very similar but just differing based on their traits. They also have access to a lot of infantry units that can act as melee units, with probably the most notable example being the Haken-Dutchmeisters, which is probably one of the most powerful melee units in the game. Being a heavy infantry with shock and melee drill and efficiency, it pretty much has every single trait you could want when it comes to a melee combat. They also have access to a lot of other shock infantry, and even a lot of skirmishing units. The infantry tab is very diverse and allows for a lot of little tinkering. Maybe you want to run the more expensive Saxon line infantry alongside, say, something like the Bavarians in order to have slightly cheaper shock units. Or maybe you want to go all cheap in order to afford Haken-Dutchmeisters. There's a lot of versatility in this infantry tab. Their cavalry tab is also very versatile, having access to a lot of volunteer units that are generally a bit cheaper, but also contain a negative and some positive perks, most notably skirmishing on their volunteers. This gives a lot of tinkering options, whether you want like a straight up shock cavalry or you'd prefer the slightly weaker but different version in the volunteer version, allowing for, again, a lot of versatility, while still being actually a pretty good cavalry tab overall. And then the artillery is actually one of the most interesting tabs. Unlike something like France and many other nations where a vanilla artillery tab makes them unappealing, Austria has one of the most interesting artillery tabs in the game, with all of their artillery having the indirect fire trait, meaning that they're able to shoot over your own units or shoot over hills or do a variety of things. It actually gives Austria some very strong artillery, often sitting on the higher end of the artillery tab than many other factions. This means that Austria generally is in sort of a push and pull thing. Not only does it have a lot of options for basic units, but I would also say that it is competing to fit in a lot of cheaper units alongside some more expensive, higher quality ones. So it's competing in that tinkering phase of, can you fit in some of these high-powered but expensive units alongside your sort of numbers-based line units? In Age of Rifles, or the late period, the Austrian Empire actually goes down in the amount of units it has, losing access to a variety of not only infantry but also cavalry units, only really gaining a single machine gun style artillery piece to compensate. However, Austria does get access to rifled breech loaders that is available in unlimited quantities on any infantry unit you want. This means that although Austria is definitely maybe losing a bit of that versatility, it still is gaining a lot of power. Its foundation of very strong melee and a lot of skirmishing is a powerful combination, backed up by the strong artillery and a well-rounded cavalry tab, means that although you maybe don't have as much tinkering in the late period as in the early period, there's still a lot of room to experiment and try stuff out with without having to sacrifice anything significant. If you've already picked up something like France, or you're just looking for maybe a good nation to learn fundamentals with, the Austrian Empire is a different but definitely viable option to try stuff out in. Rounding out our European powers, the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont, or Italy, is a very interesting faction. It is a faction that I think is best described by having access to very cheap infantry units that have really good perks on them, but are also kind of paper thin. And this is a theme that runs throughout most of Italy. Their units are chock full of very powerful traits, yet at the same time often suffer from low cohesion and often low health. This makes their infantry tab potentially quite powerful. They do have access to some basic infantry units that just have disorganized, essentially very similar to that of the Russian units, but they also then fill it out with a lot of rugged units or units that sport very unique traits. The red shirts probably being among the most interesting, having a mixture of efficiency and also rugged means that the red shirts are potentially very powerful in wrapping around the enemy, but at the same time, they're very weak, so they can bring in high numbers, but will have to really make those numbers work because 1v1, Italy will lose most of its infantry engagements. Its cavalry is pretty solid overall, having access to actually a decent amount of rugged cavalry that not many other nations have. It also has some vanilla kind of standard options in case you want those. And its artillery is also underwhelming, being very vanilla, with its light howitzer actually being even worse than many of the other standard nations. So artillery is not a strength. Italy is definitely a faction that relies on kind of the map to make itself work, relying a lot on the fact that so many of its units have rugged, being able to flank the enemy in devastating ways, and then also being able to make use of its superior numbers to win. It's, in a way, a quantity-based faction like Russia or the Ottomans, who generally have some, often have a superior numbers, which Italy also will have to rely on. But they definitely do it in a unique way by having access to very powerful traits on their spammy infantry units. The late period actually does not add that much to Italy. The best they get is really just a very cheap militia unit and the fact that they get a couple RBLs to put on their heavier units. Otherwise, Italy operates in a very similar manner, although you can also put breech loaders on stuff like your red shirts, which can be potentially quite powerful, especially because they have that efficiency trait. Prussia has proven that efficiency and breech loaders can be very powerful. But otherwise, Italy remains largely the same. It doesn't get any benefit, any extra artillery options, and its cavalry remains practically the same. So really the biggest change, it doesn't get a whole lot, but Italy is already unique enough that they already can stand out and play quite differently than many of the other European nations. If you're looking for a faction that is sort of numbers based, but also has like some really unique units and a lot of rugged, then Italy is actually the nation that will be very interesting to you. Now, we are on to the DLC nations. The first one is the United States of America, or the Union, representing in the American Civil War. This faction is very interesting in that it's very melee focused. The simple fact is that its units have lower cohesion than normal, Most other units have generally about 4 cohesion, whereas the Union in general has access to but 3 cohesion on its line infantry. This means that they are also overall cheaper but weaker than their standard units. However, this is backed up by a lot of melee perks on their units. Notably, things like the Irish Brigade and Iron Brigade all are containing shock, making them very, very powerful if they get into melee by being able to outnumber the enemy and overwhelm them through a large amount of shock options. There also have something notable in the US sharpshooters, which are actually the only units to get rifled breechloaders in the early period. These guys are quite light, having low cohesion and low health, but with range drill and rifled breechloaders, they are actually absurdly powerful and deal a lot of damage in pretty much any scenario. Their cavalry, although limited in number, is still very powerful. Having access to the breech-loading carbines in the early period, these guys can dish out a lot of damage by shooting at stuff. On top of that, they also have access to skirmishing, and Custer's Brigade notably has shock alongside negative traits. It's an interesting combination and is definitely very different in terms of its setup compared to standard European cavalry. However, I would overall say that the Union benefits from stronger light cavalry, being able to make use of a variety of cheap, fast-moving units that are well statted and generally, I think, have a bit of an edge compared to their standard European counterparts. The artillery of the Union is also kind of a mixed bag. The biggest upside of their nation is the 3-inch ordnance rifle, which is actually a pretty powerful artillery piece. Having range drill at 4 range, it's actually pretty good. But you also trade this off by having a weak indirect unit with only 3 range. So there's a bit of an upside and a bit of a downside. But overall, the Union is a faction that, if it's able to make up for its lower cohesion, can bring superior numbers to a fight and overwhelm the enemy while not having to really deal with any negative perks like disorganized or breakable. If utilized well, the Union pretty much just gets to have a bigger army without ever having to deal with a negative downside. The late period for the Union doesn't change a whole lot for them. They don't get any new infantry units. They do get breechloaders on their units. However, it is notable that the RBLs only remain on the sharpshooters, and that has not changed since their early period. They do get a new unit in regular cavalry, which at the moment has rugged, although there is potentially a rework coming that might make these more interesting in the future. And then they also get a Gatling gun, which is, again, a powerful overall unit. Overall, the Union in the late period relatively stays the same to its earlier period, just bringing a little less to the fight. The Union is still melee focused and still looking to get up close and personal and use overwhelming numbers to beat the enemy before their low cohesion becomes a problem. The final faction that is currently available within Fire and Maneuver is the Confederate States of America, or the CSA. It is a faction that is in some ways similar to Prussia, having access to a lot of efficiency on practically all of its infantry units. However, unlike Prussia, it has a stronger emphasis on good cavalry while having underwhelming artillery. Talking about its infantry for a minute, it's actually very capable and well-rounded. Having generally higher at least standard cohesion, it doesn't have any heavy units, but this also helps to keep the cost on the cheaper side, allowing the Confederacy to bring a bit more in terms of numbers without, being broken and not being able to take anything else with it. The faction also has a variety of versatility with things like range drill on the Stonewall, shock for melee on the Louisiana Tigers, the Texas Brigade having rugged, alongside cheaper volunteers if you're looking for budget units. Its cavalry is potentially very powerful. Uniquely, they do have access to a rugged cavalry, and also Hampton's brigade arguably sits as the strongest light cavalry in the game. At 6 health, 4 cohesion, it's very well statted. It has shock, skirmishing, and efficiency, and is able to bring in breech loading carbines. Pretty much Hamptons can do anything you need of a light cavalry, and this makes them very, very powerful, albeit very, very expensive. And then, as mentioned, their artillery is actually quite underwhelming and very weak. The Confederacy has to rely on the fact that it gets efficiency on so many of its units and its potentially very powerful light cavalry in order to carry the day. Now, it's not the strongest in melee outside of the Louisiana Tigers, but it also is actually very good at shooting. Efficiency is order hungry, and this is probably the biggest thing with the Confederacy, is that it will overall lack in the needed orders to use all of its units to full potential. However, its units can zip around the battlefield, change formation, and then unleash devastating fire before the enemy is able to react. And if utilized well, the Confederacy can be extremely annoying to deal with. In the late period, the Confederacy gets potentially a very, very strong unit in the Whitworth sharpshooters, who finally get access to the RBLs. Combining efficiency, range drill with RBLs on a relatively cheap unit gives the Confederacy a very strong firing platform that, if they take careful of, can be very, very powerful. As I've mentioned with things like France and Britain, range drill and efficiency with RBLs is disgusting, and these guys are some of the cheapest ways to get access to that. They also get a new unit in regular cavalry, like the Union, which is essentially just a light cavalry with rugged, although there is again talks of this being made into this unit being reworked in the future, so this may change. And then they also get a Gatling gun, which gives them some strong firepower if you're able to utilize it well. The Confederacy is a very interesting faction, kind of acting like a Prussia, but yet it is able to bring in larger amounts of units because they're not nearly as expensive, and it has better cavalry but weaker artillery. It plays in a very loose and aggressive style, wanting to wrap around the enemy and overwhelm them through the abuse of efficiency, rather than getting into like prolonged slugging matches where lower cohesion and sometimes maybe certain lacking aspects will hurt the Confederacy. Overall, if you're just starting out within Fire and Maneuver, here are my recommendations as to units or factions that you should unlock. Starting out, I think that France or the Austrian Empire should be one of your first pickups. These are well-rounded nations that are generally comfortable in most positions because of their focus on strong infantry, and this makes them very easy to pick up and play around with. They are just generally a safe bet. I would then personally recommend looking into either the Russian, Ottoman, or Italy in terms of having a quantity-based faction. I believe that Russia is probably the easiest quantity-based faction to play with, but you could easily go with the Ottomans if you want a very different play, or the Italians if you want sort of a rugged style play and still want some decent-ish line units. But the Russians have generally the most solid foundation and still are able to bring in superior numbers. Then, after that, your third option, I think, is generally quite open. You could opt for something like Prussia or Britain, which are both generally some of the harder nations to master, but they do have some very powerful tools and are a bit more of the quality factions. Depending on which one after you unlock your first three, you can pretty much go in any order you want. Just simply feel around. If you like France, you'll probably like Austria. If you like the Russian Empire, you'll probably like the Ottomans and Italy. If you like something like Prussia, then the United Kingdom might be a similarly interesting pickup. If you are a fan of quantity factions, the Union is a very strong contender. And if you're looking for another well-rounded unit, then the Confederates might be something to look into. Although they're not as well-rounded as the French or the Austrians, they do still have a well-rounded infantry tab that can be comfortable in most positions. They just lean towards a more offensive approach. Now, it is fair to say that these two factions are locked in the DLC, which you have to pay real money for. And I will probably do a video in the future covering that. If you're interested in me giving a review of the Fire Maneuver DLC, leave a comment down below and let me know. And then subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. But overall, I think that these factions are very interesting and definitely play in unique enough ways that the DLC does offer unique factions to play with. With that all said, we are at the end of the video for today. It is overall up to you which nation sounds interesting to you. Everybody has different preferences, but hopefully this video has been useful to maybe give you some insight into what the different nations entail and which ones sound interesting to you. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out on future Fire and Maneuver content and also supporting the channel. And make sure that if you are enjoying the game, I would suggest considering to unlock the DLC. It supports the developers of this game and also gets you two very interesting factions that are quite fun. It is something that I think everybody should at least consider because this is a small indie game and we should show our support if we really are enjoying it as much as we do. Other than that, that is all I have for you today. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.